out the rest of the nonsense from the dean. So, this is an area in which we have focused a lot and really paid a lot of attention overall as an institution. And it is certainly, given how important it is to us and to our mission overall, and given how important it is in the area of health law, the opportunity to really find that intersection and dive into it is something that I think is really wonderful. And it's really wonderful that we have a speaker who's able to do that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to sit and listen and I'm sure learn a great deal. But first, I'll turn it over to Mary, who's been leading this effort. So thank you.
Thank you, Dean Hammoudi. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to share just a few logistics. After the formal lecture concludes, there'll be a little time for question and answers, both for those of you who are here with us in the courtroom and for, I think we have over 100 people registered to be with us on Zoom today. So if you are with us on Zoom and you have a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And once we get to the question period, I'll be monitoring those and we'll have an opportunity to raise those up for the speaker. So I am really honored today to introduce Sam Bagenstos as the 2023 Nordenberg Lecturer. Sam currently serves as the General Counsel to the Department of Health and Human Services, a role that he assumed in June of last year after serving as General Counsel to the Office of Management and Budget beginning in January 2021. He is providing this public service while on leave from the University of Michigan's School of Law, where he is the Frank G. Millard Professor of Law. This traversing of professional worlds is typical of Sam's career. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina and his JD from Harvard Law School, graduating first in his class. After clerking for Judge Stephen Reinhart on the Ninth Circuit, Sam started his career as a civil rights lawyer at the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. He left that position to serve as a law clerk to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Supreme Court. Although I've mostly known Sam for his scholarly work, in preparing this introduction, I learned that he is also a recidivist public servant, working at high levels of federal and state governments to deploy his unparalleled expertise to advance the common good, and more specifically, to implement civil rights protections so as to ensure a more equitable society. From 2009 to 2011, Bagenstos served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and that's the #2 position in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. There, his accomplishments included the promulgation of the 2010 Americans with Disabilities Act regulations, the first comprehensive update of those regulations since they were first promulgated in 1991. And he also worked on the reinvigoration of the Civil Rights Division's enforcement of the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Olmstead versus LC, which guarantees people with disabilities the right to live and receive services in the most integrated setting appropriate. Once back in Michigan, he was appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer to chair the Michigan Employment Relations Commission, the state agency that enforces the rights of public employees to unionize and collectively bargain. Bagenstos has testified before Congress on several occasions, including in support of the Fair Pay Restoration Act, the ADA Amendments Act, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, as well as on the ADA's application to advancing technology and to the problem of mental illness in prisons. He's also been an active appellate and U.S. Supreme Court litigator in civil rights and federalism cases, arguing 4 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, including Young versus United Parcel Service, which established new protections for pregnant workers. He's taught at 4 law schools, including Washington University in St. Louis, Harvard, and UC Berkeley. As an academic, he's published numerous articles in journals such as the Yale Law Journal, the Stanford Law Review, the Columbia Law Review, the California Law Review, the Virginia Law Review. I could go on, but you kind of get the message here. He publishes in the top level journals. He's also published 2 books, Law and the Contradictions of the Disability Rights Movement, and a case book on disability rights law. Sam has also written articles for non-academic audiences in publications such as Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, The American Prospect, The Washington Monthly, and The New Republic. In my own work, I have relied extensively on Sam's scholarship, which is unfailingly rigorous, creative, cogent, and compassionate. So I am really excited to hear what he has to share with us today. Please join me in welcoming Sam Bagenstos.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. Every time I hear an introduction of me that goes through my career like that, I realize that, you know, the basic takeaway is I am incapable of keeping a job, or alternatively, I am incapable of avoiding being bored by a job and kind of jump from job to job. But it seems to have worked out for me. I am incredibly happy to be here. I'm really pleased. Mary Crossley's work is work that when I was starting as an academic back over 2 decades ago and trying to figure out what is the work that I want to do? What do I want to write about? You know, I had some sense that I wanted to be a scholar. You know, I'd been a practitioner, I'd been a law clerk, and I hadn't really written very much in my life and you know, very much academic, but I had this sense an academic was sort of something I wanted to be, wasn't sure what that looked like. Disability law was an area that mattered a lot to me personally, that I had a lot of professional experience in my, at that point, very young career. I had the great opportunity to work on some of the early ADA cases in the early mid-90s, and sort of decided there's something interesting here to write about, but I didn't know what to do with it academically. And Mary's work was among the work that in those early years I read, you know, really assiduously and learned a lot from, not just about the topics she was writing about, but about how to write about disability, how to write about disability in a way that was academically interesting, that was theoretically interesting, that was, I mean, I'll use the same word Mary used about me, that was compassionate, that took very seriously the important claims on various sides. So I was just incredibly honored to get an invitation from Mary to speak here, and really so appreciate the introduction. I very much appreciate the Dean's introduction. I appreciate the Nordenberg family for this lecture event, and the University of Pittsburgh. As I think I was telling Mary earlier, my father years and years ago, long before I was born, and I'm fairly old now, was a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh. So the University of Pittsburgh has great meaning for our family and for me. And so that's just incredibly touching to be invited to speak here. So thank you for this. And I'll say I very much appreciate the opportunity to return even for a couple of hours to an academic setting. You know, my job now is, to quote a line that didn't work well for the person who used it, Robert Bork, my job now is an intellectual feast in some ways, but it's an intellectual feast that I often have to pass up. You know, I often get to look at and not take, actually kind of like the lunch upstairs that I didn't really partake in that much just now. And there are so many interesting issues that come up in my job at the Department of Health and Human Services. They're really important to the world, but they also raise interesting intellectual questions that I have to do what those of you who are practitioners of mindfulness meditation do, you know, note it, put it aside without judging, right? I have to just put it out of my mind without judging. I miss the chance to think really deeply and conceptually about the issues that tie our work together. So the invitation to speak here is one I seized on as the opportunity to take a breath, pull back the lens a bit, and pull back the lens will be a bit of a theme of what I'm talking about. pull back the lens on the day-to-day work that I do and try to explore some aspect of the bigger picture. I decided to play a little bit with an idea that I've been thinking about a lot since the COVID pandemic first hit us a little over 3 years ago. And it's something I was thinking about a lot in some both scholarly work I was doing and some advocacy I was doing in the early days of the COVID pandemic. But as I reflected on it, it's an idea that actually has, and a set of ideas and intellectual moves that have really occupied me for at least 30 years since I was in law school. And that's the idea of thinking about justice, and here health justice particularly, not as a static concept measured by a snapshot in time, but a concept that's realized over a period of time. And that when we think about justice, and particularly health justice, as a concept that's realized over a period of time, that gives us a new window, an important window on stuff we may have already known about, but maybe weren't bringing to the fore about how to diagnose the problem, but also gives us an important window on ways of thinking about how to resolve the problem of justice. Now, to some extent, you're like, yeah, this is like totally obvious. I mean, let's think about some of the major theories of justice that occupy, folks in the academy, the ones that people like me tend to find particularly compelling. I think for a lot of us, we start with someone like Rawls, and I think like 17-year-old me thought John Rawls had it all figured out. I will say 53-year-old me does not, but 17-year-old me really did. And 53-year-old me still feels driven a lot by a lot of Rawlsian moves. Well, of course, he's talking about how to set up the basic structure of a society that is going to create certain incentives and conduce to certain outcomes over time, right? He's not talking about a snapshot in time. You think about someone like Martha Nussbaum, whose work has also been very influential on me, talking about the development of capabilities in individuals. That's necessarily a developmental process that happens over time. Even if you think about the leading utilitarian philosophers, right? They're talking about often, well, how do we get to something that maximizes utils, whatever, however we're thinking about that? Well, they're often thinking about creating incentives for something that happens over time. So all of that is true, and yet we often don't think about particular issues of justice in the day-to-day as reflecting a process that plays out over time, or how the fact that they reflect a process that plays out over time affects how we should respond today. The closest place we get to this, and I will get back to this at various points in this talk, is when we think about racial discrimination and racial injustice, structural racial injustice. Often we think about racial discrimination as some discrete thing, and certainly the law does, as some discrete thing that happens today that harms people today. But there are many of us who like to think about racial injustice as something that reflects actually a historical pattern, right? As reflecting a historical set of decisions that have layered on themselves over time, that have ramified over time to create a particular situation. If you think about, I was very honored to have the opportunity to clerk for Justice Ginsburg. People talk about a lot of her opinions. The opinion of hers that I find to be the absolute most compelling opinion was actually a very, very brief dissenting opinion that she issued in the case Missouri versus Jenkins. You probably have read Missouri versus Jenkins, one of the 3 Missouri versus Jenkins decisions of the Supreme Court, maybe a couple of them. Almost no law student has read all 3 because one of them is just about attorney's fees. But if you've read Jenkins 3, you may not have even noticed Justice Ginsburg's dissent. She didn't write the principal dissenting opinion in that case. Justice Souter did. But her dissenting opinion, just a few lines, says, hey, wait a minute. We're talking about ending a desegregation decree that lasted for 8 years in Missouri. Well, how did we get to the start of that 8 years. And she goes back to the Code Noir when France controlled Louisiana and said, when France controlled Louisiana, there was state mandated not just segregation, but subjugation of Black citizens, of Black people, who were not even regarded as citizens. And then she just lists just the salient list of all the, of slavery and Jim Crow and all the things, just about 8 or 9 lines. And she says, against that history, 8 years is ephemeral. And trying to establish the point that we've now seen established in scholarship so much about racial discrimination being something that ramifies over time. It's not just some person with a bad intent today doing something to someone today. It ramifies over time, yet the law the law increasingly, as Jenkins shows, makes it hard to take account of that. So what I want to do is take sort of that insight and think about it in terms of health justice problems generally, about pulling back the frame, right? So and thinking not just about disparities today at a static moment in time, not just looking at today's distributive outcomes, not just looking at particular practices undertaken today to see whether they accord with some sense of justice just as of today, but to ask whether there is some way that thinking about the fact that we exist, that these practices exist in a world that's developed over time, whether that matters. And I will say that there is quite persistently a failure to do that in the way we think about cases in the day-to-day. So I have like 4 motivating cases here, 4 cases that I want, they're not cases in court, but they're sort of case studies that I want to talk about, where there is a discourse about health justice that doesn't take account of the way that justice problems develop over time, and that I think should. So a couple of them come from the COVID pandemic. One is something I did a lot of both scholarly and advocacy work on in the early days of the COVID pandemic, the so-called crisis standards of care issue. And it's an issue that in my current job, I advise our Office for Civil Rights at HHS about. So what are crisis standards of care? Many of you probably know this. The hospital systems and state health departments often have a set of protocols that say, look, if there is for some reason an inability to provide health care to everyone who needs it, to provide emergency care or care that's needed on an urgent basis to everyone who needs it, then we might flip from our usual rule that if you show up and need health care, and by the way, can pay, another thing I'm going to talk about in a minute, you get health care. We might flip from that usual rule to a rule where we have some explicit kind of rationing, right? We have implicit rationing all the time, but where we have some explicit kind of rationing. And that is a crisis, and the explicit rationing is crisis standards of care. In the pandemic early days, we found that a lot of states and a lot of hospital systems had written crisis standards of care that they had prepared before the pandemic, but that they either flipped into effect or were prepared to flip into effect, that explicitly excluded people from life-saving treatment because of particular disabilities. Often these were disabilities like developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities. Sometimes they were disabilities that might have a closer relationship to the kind of treatment being provided. But if you had one of these disabilities in one of these states, the way the protocols were written, if there weren't enough, say, ventilators to go around, which was a real concern in the early days of the pandemic, when we had that early set of waves when there were no effective treatments, there were no vaccines, and it was really scary and deadly. If there weren't enough ventilators to go around, well, if you were in one of these disadvantaged groups, you were at the bottom of the list and you were excluded. Or you were deprioritized in some way, again, explicitly because of particular kinds of disabilities, or in some cases because of age. Like if there aren't enough to go around, well, we start by saying, you know, the 80-year-olds don't get the ventilators, and then we kind of go up the list. Now, in the event these crisis standards of care with their explicitly discriminatory provisions did not, for the most part, have any bite, right? So they were often triggered. A lot of hospital systems and states said we are in a crisis standard of care position, and so the crisis standards of care are going to be triggered. But in the event, it's difficult to find individual cases on any widespread basis where people were denied ventilators because of their disabilities or because of their age. There are some isolated cases, but it was not as widespread as people were concerned about at the time. But nonetheless, the fact that these policies were written down and explicitly discriminatory and were triggered by the state and by certain hospital systems led to a number of administrative complaints with the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Health and Human Services on the grounds that they were discriminatory illegally based on disability or age. And so that's one set of cases where we have what is a health justice problem, a potential denial of life-saving treatment explicitly on the basis of a class status, of a classification that is itself tied to systemic disadvantage. And that was at the time often thought of as this is a health justice problem that we can look at today. People with disabilities being denied life-saving treatment. Okay. Another example, and I'll get to the broadening it in a minute. Another example, COVID and the impacts of COVID that were disproportionate and have been and remain disproportionate based on race or sex or class. And, you know, even today, if we look at the numbers, I mean, I just pulled the most recent CDC numbers, age adjusted, for COVID hospitalizations and death based on racial categories. And, you know, if you look at hospitalizations and deaths based on racial categories, so if you are American Indian or Alaskan Native, your chances of COVID hospitalization or death are between 2 and 2.5 times what they are for white people. If you're African American, between 1.5 and 2 times. If you're Hispanic, between 1.5 and 2 times. Vastly greater likelihood of hospitalization and death from COVID if you are a member of one of these racialized minority groups. And we know that particularly in the earliest days of COVID, when we had substantial lockdown, social distancing, and other very serious public health measures imposed, both the economic effects of those measures and that continuing health problems notwithstanding those measures were disproportionately visited on people who were working class, people who were members of racial minority groups, and people who were women. And, you know, it's obvious when you think about it, you know, well, what are the jobs where people are going to be able to continue to work and make money and, you know, do fine by themselves and not put themselves in harm's way? It's jobs like mine, either the job I had when I was an academic or the job I have now where you can do them remotely, but service jobs, jobs providing in-person care, whether in nursing homes and other congregate facilities, which were a hotbed of COVID, or in hospitals or in other settings, childcare settings, right? Those are jobs that cannot be performed remotely. So those are the people doing those jobs are put in the position of, you know, deciding, Do I forego my economic, my economic earning power, or do I put myself in harm's way? And people made either choice, and either one was risky. And of course, those are jobs that are disproportionately female and minority jobs in the United States at this point in time. Again, a justice issue related to health, often thought of as, well, look at this, the effects of COVID, the health effects and the economic effects of COVID fall more heavily on members of racial minority groups, on women, on working people, and particularly people in, in working class jobs. Okay, so a couple of COVID examples. I'll give you a couple other examples. Drug prices. So one way to think about drug prices, which in this country are an incredible burden for people, at all levels of the economic hierarchy. My mother is on Humira. She does just fine by herself. It is a very serious burden to spend money. Won't be in a year after some of the provisions of the president's drug pricing bill kick in, but has been a very significant burden. But for people who are poor, working class, much harder to address issues of drug prices, to get these drugs, which are absolutely essential to preserving life, or to preserving the ability to go through life in the way that we all would like to go through life, particularly people who have chronic conditions that require costly long-term interventions. These are individuals who are substantially burdened by drug prices. These are individuals who also, people with chronic long-term conditions that need these kinds of interventions, are disproportionately likely to be uninsured. They're disproportionately likely to be poorer. They're disproportionately likely to be members of racial minority groups. And if they're uninsured, they're going to lack access to negotiated discounts and other ways of addressing costs that we have adopted in our system. That is a problem for everyone, but it's a health justice problem for a particular group of people to be denied access to life-saving or at least life-enhancing in very significant ways treatment. Health insurance coverage in general. We live in a society, not every society is structured this way, ours is. Health insurance is essential in this country to get any significant health care. That's not to say you can't get care if you're not insured. There are lots of ways people get uninsured care. But the significant provision of health care in the United States depends on having health insurance. So any gap in health insurance might be considered an incident of health injustice, right? So there's a big dispute within, or big debate within the health justice literature. Is health justice something that is about individuals or about groups? I don't really need to answer that here, but we often think about that as, if you're uninsured, that's in and of itself a health injustice. And here, the injustice is exacerbated by various group patterns, right? So who is likely to be uninsured in the United States of America? Well, disproportionately, particularly after the Affordable Care Act, we're talking about the working poor, and we're talking about the working poor in certain states particularly, right? Because we're talking about people who fall into the Medicaid gap, people who are too poor to have access to subsidized private health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, who are working in jobs that don't itself provide private insurance, whether because they're part-time contingent, because they're independent contractors, whatever, but who are not poor enough to get Medicaid under what are often quite stingy state Medicaid eligibility requirements in the now dwindling, but still significant number of states that have not expanded Medicaid to fill that gap. That is a problem of injustice for the individuals who are not insured, but it's also a problem of injustice that is patterned, right? I mean, we're talking about this, it has a group-based pattern. We're talking about working poor. Disproportionately in the gap are Black, Latino, and Native American individuals. Okay, so we can think about all of these problems as raising all sorts of different issues, right? I mean, health justice is one lens. There are lots of lenses to think about these issues, and I like to think about these issues in various ways. But let's think about them in a health justice lens. It's easy to see them as health justice problems at a static point in time. Crisis standards of care, right? It's right now you have a person with a disability who needs life-saving treatment who's being denied life-saving treatment because of their disability. That is a health justice problem. It's also doctrinally, potentially a violation of anti-discrimination law. The impact of COVID on poor, working class, members of minority races, or women, right? This is also something that is a problem right now. Just look at what's going on. Drug prices. They harm people who can't pay. They harm minorities and the working poor, people without insurance, disproportionately. That's a problem right now. We don't have to look at anything greater than that. And of course, the Medicaid gap harms the working poor directly. And maybe that's all we care about, right? There is a group of people right now who are being disproportionately denied something. And that might be enough to motivate a response, a justice-based response. That might be enough to say, look, we understand this is a problem. And often we see that that is what the response is. The response is to fix the static thing. So when the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services received a bunch of complaints filed by people, including me, in the last administration, they issued guidance saying, you know what? You can't, state hospital system, have a system that explicitly rations care based on stereotypes about a disability or age. They didn't say anything about anything other than the particular transaction at issue. And when I was out in the world as an advocate, I touted that and said, look at what HHS did. HHS has endorsed our views. Now I'm in HHS and I can talk about that less. So I will talk about it less. But you hear me talking in the past tense a lot about this. When we talk about COVID's general disproportionate impacts, again, what's the response? Well, we often see the response as, let's surge vaccination or Paxlovid to minority communities. Let's do what we can to make sure that we are rectifying the imbalance in terms of the impacts of COVID. Let's make sure that working communities get particular, COVID payments so that people can stay home from their jobs. Obviously there were a lot of public policy discussions in the early days of COVID. What should we do should we keep businesses open in various ways, keep service businesses open? Should we take a sort of more European model and freeze things in and just pay people? And we took kind of both sides of that argument, depending on where we were and when we were and the kinds of payments we were talking about. But one response we have is let's respond to the COVID imbalances directly. Let's see if members of minority groups who are being disproportionately harmed by COVID, well, let's surge support to members of minority groups and to those communities to make sure that they're getting the response to COVID they need. Drug prices, let's provide discounts for disadvantaged communities. Let's provide programs that make it easier to provide drugs to disadvantaged communities. We have federal programs that do that. We have, various drug companies themselves have made decisions to try to provide certain kinds of advantages and discounts to disadvantaged communities. Maybe that's what we do. And insurance coverage gaps. Let's close the gaps, right? That's basically been the strategy of the Biden administration, is to try to close coverage gaps. We had proposals before Congress to close the Medicaid gap from the Affordable Care Act for the states that didn't take up the Medicaid expansion. Remember, when the Affordable Care Act was adopted, the assumption was every state would do it, because would take up the Medicaid expansion because it was tied to all of Medicaid. The Supreme Court in the NFIB case said, no, actually, we're going to separate Medicaid expansion from Medicaid, and a state can turn down Medicaid expansion without losing all of its traditional Medicaid. That left the gap. There have been various proposals, and the Biden administration has itself proposed to Congress closing that gap. The Biden administration has done various things in various of these bills to move toward closing the gap, even if not close the gap entirely. Regulations closing the so-called family glitch, which made it hard for people to get affordable care on the marketplace side, for example, and other types of rules that went for as long as the pandemic was. Well, maybe if the problem is gaps in health insurance, let's close the gap. Let's make sure everybody, no matter where they sit, has some way to get some good health insurance policy. All of these are good, positive interventions. I have pursued them in various capacities and continue to pursue them in my current capacity. But they focus on the injustice or the problem at a particular moment in time. And therefore, they may not be optimal. They may not fully address the true justice problem that exists. Just like, well, I'll get to that in a second. So let's think about what's the problem that exists. Let's pull back the lens and see how these are problems that have, each of these four problems is a problem that has developed over time. And that maybe an intervention at a different point in time, or now, an intervention now, thinking about the same thing that might happen in the future, might be a more optimal response or a necessary response in addition to whatever we're doing at this moment in time with the injustice we see. So when we think about the problem of rationing, of crisis standards of care, rationing in a time of scarcity, of unusual scarcity, well, part of what's going on there certainly is when people are drawing up these plans about what we're going to do in a time of unusual scarcity, they have certain stereotypes about disability. That's the static injustice. And that's a real injustice, right? So people assume, well, like what's the assumption behind I'm not going to give a ventilator? If I have 10 ventilators and 11 patients, I'm not going to give a ventilator to the person who has an intellectual disability. It's a set of stereotypes about quality of life. That's an injustice. That's the static injustice. The injustice that we think about when we think about this as a problem over time is, why were there only 10 ventilators when we could predict that 11 were necessary? So it's a way, which is a way of sort of crystallizing the idea that it's a failure of pandemic preparedness. And when we think about pandemic preparedness, we don't think about that necessarily as a justice issue. We think about that as an issue of public health. We think about that as an issue of, making sure that we are ready for something that's going to happen in the future. Just like we might think about earthquake preparedness or, resilience to climate change. But in the same way that when we think about resilience to climate change, we need to recognize that who are the people who are going to bear disproportionate burdens if we're not resilient to climate change? It's likely to be poor people. It's likely to be members of disenfranchised, disadvantaged, racial minority groups. Well, the same thing is true for failures of pandemic preparedness. Right now, there are active debates in Washington about what do we need to do to prepare for the next pandemic? And everybody takes the view that we need to do more. The president has proposed a budget to do more, has on many occasions pushed to do more. Members of Congress say they support that, but we are not at the moment investing more. And a lot of the discourse around that is, that's going to be bad because it's going to be bad for the economy, or that's going to be bad because people are going to get sick. True. It's also going to be bad because it's going to lead to another situation where we have to make these tragic choices. And when we have to make these tragic choices, we can predict that they are going to disproportionately burden certain groups. And I would submit that that's a problem, not just because it's going to have those effects, but because it tells us something about our political system, which is our political system doesn't take those issues of justice seriously enough and doesn't take the needs and concerns of individuals who are people with disabilities or individuals who are members of more disadvantaged, disenfranchised groups seriously, because if it did, we would recognize that we need to invest more now. So that gives us a lens on the COVID crisis standards of care problem that suggests the answer is not just do rationing better, but that might assume actually in any world where we're going to do rationing, all of the same biases and stereotypes and historical injustices that lead us to do rationing in a way that disadvantages particular groups, those are still going to happen. We could get rid of, one set of principles that disadvantage people with disabilities in a particular way, but the biases will still be there. What we need to do is broaden the lens, think about this as a problem to be solved at time one, when the pandemic is in the future, as opposed to at time two, when the pandemic is upon us. So what about the disproportionate impacts of COVID? So again, like one way of responding to that is to say, we surge healthcare and COVID care, COVID treatments, COVID vaccinations to these disproportionately affected communities. Good idea. But we also have to recognize that the problem with what causes these disproportionate effects are a lot of things, including a lot of societal decisions outside of the healthcare sphere that have been made over a very long period of time. And this gets me back to Justice Ginsburg and the Jenkins case, right? Why do we have a situation where it is disproportionately poor people, women, minorities who are in jobs where they need to be in contact with people? Why do we have a situation where it is disproportionately members of minority groups who live in such close quarters that a communicable disease is more easy to spread? Well, that has to do with historic patterns of occupational and residential segregation, which were built up over a series of decisions over time. And we can, again, surge responses to COVID to particular disproportionately affected communities. But this issue is going to happen again if we don't solve that problem. We don't solve the problem of residential and occupational segregation. We also, why do we have these disproportionate problems? Well, in addition to occupational segregation by race and sex, we have a lack of various employment protections in this country just as a general matter that exists in many other places. We don't have paid leave for taking care of one's family. We don't have paid sick leave mandates in many places. One of the positive impacts, I'm hoping, of the pandemic is people are now realizing how important it is for people to stay home when they're sick. Although I think that is also kind of dissipating a little bit. And there has been some momentum toward paid sick leave in response to COVID. Certainly there was in the immediate response in some of the COVID response legislation. But what COVID shows us is this is a problem that's going to arise again. And the only way we can avoid these kinds of disproportionate impacts is not just to surge treatments and vaccines and protections to particular groups that are disproportionately affected during a pandemic at time two, but to have a structure at time one that works to undermine residential and occupational segregation and to provide employment protections so that people are not going to be put in harm's way. And that will avoid the disproportionate effects. And again, the failure to do that and the backing away from that as soon as the crisis is over suggests a justice problem of its own, a political system that doesn't take seriously the needs and interests of women, of working people, of minority groups. So how do we think about drug prices? Well, again, it's an injustice at the moment. There's a drug. It would really help me. I can't access it because I don't have the money. But it's also, when you pull back the lens and think about this over time, what are those drug prices? Well, this is, a common move. The drug prices are the product of a system that gives a lot of public resources to private entities and then allows them to reap an enormous benefit from it without regulating very significantly the benefit that they reap, right? So we now have a drug price negotiation law that was just adopted that actually I spend an enormous amount of my professional time working to make sure is implemented in a timely and lawful way. First set of drugs to be negotiated under that law. The list of those drugs will come out this fall, and we are assiduously preparing for that. That's going to cover 10 drugs in the first year. It's going to go up, by a certain number of drugs for the next several years. There have been proposals, the president has proposed to expand that to a larger number of drugs more quickly. Only for drugs in the Medicare system, not for drugs in the private system at the moment, because of decisions that were made by the Senate parliamentarian last year. If you all were following it, next time I give a lecture, I'll give a lecture on the Berg rule, which is extremely interesting, actually. It is actually extremely interesting and infuriating, but we have tended in our political system to respond to the problem of drug prices by saying, okay, let's figure out a way to lower the drug prices. Let's think about, if the public is financing the basic research or the applied research that's going into the development of the drugs, let's think about retaining some rights for the public, right? So you see different variations of this, including some intellectual property litigation and disputes that are going on right now, all the way up to various proposals for exercising so-called march-in rights under the Bayh-Dole Act and other things. All of this, is stuff that we need to talk about and obviously very high on the agenda. It's not often thought of as a justice issue. And thinking about the system that creates these high drug prices, instead of thinking about, well, when these drug prices are high, how do we lower them? How do we, when someone charges a rate that is exorbitant, how do we figure out how to get that number down? What are the levers we have? That's one way to do it. That is our current way of doing it, right? So Inflation Reduction Act says we have drug price negotiation in the Medicare system for a certain number of drugs. We have inflation rebates that if drug companies increase their prices above the rate of inflation, they have to rebate that to the Medicare system, for example. We have other ways of kind of trying to limit the price of drugs. We have the 340B discount program for hospitals that serve poor areas where they have to buy they have to be offered drugs at a discount if drug companies want to have access to Medicare and Medicaid. We have the Medicaid drug rebate program. Again, for drug companies, if they want to have access to Medicaid, they have to provide rebates to the Medicaid program. We have various ad hoc ways of trying to blunt these high drug prices. But a health justice over time perspective would say, these are all time two problems. Maybe we should think about at time one, what's the system that we've created that gives a lot of public resources in the way of research funding, in the way of intellectual property, and various other kinds of supports, guaranteed purchases of various kinds to drug companies, and then allows them to set prices the way they do. Is that a good system? And then health insurance, and I see it's 1:30, so I have a little bit more I was going to say, but I'm going to try to wrap up so that you all have some time for questions. Health insurance. So the focus has been on closing the gaps. That's good. That makes sense, right? So there are people who don't have insurance. Let's make sure they have insurance. You need insurance to get healthcare in this country. Great. The problem is when you pull back the lens and look at the issue over time, there are very few people who have the same insurance forever. Our health insurance system in the United States is one where there is an enormous amount of churn on a daily, monthly, yearly basis. And people, those kinds of systems, and we're going to see this, unfortunately, in the unwinding of the public health emergency, which kept states from redetermining people's eligibility for Medicaid. We're going to see a microcosm of this. A system like that, where people's eligibility for different insurance depends on different aspects of their life, what their job is, what their income is, what state they live in. Even if we could close all the gaps so that there is insurance that covers every job and every income and every state, there would still be churn and people falling off of one insurance before they got onto another because of issues of administrative burden, because of issues of uncertainty. Now, we can try to blunt that all we want, but that does suggest that if we pull ourselves back to a time one perspective, maybe we need to think about a health insurance system that doesn't require different insurance for different stages of life and different incomes and different states you live in, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So just want to say a couple of other things. One is, so there's an obvious relationship to between what I'm talking about and the sort of broad interest these days in so-called social determinants of health, right? And the various ways of instantiating social determinants of health, right? Social determinants of health, like, so you think about like housing is healthcare, food is healthcare. You think about like there are different ways that people can promote health that are not just about what kind of health insurance they get, what kind of doctor they see, what kind of treatment they get. And, to some extent, what I'm talking, social determinants of health and the way people talk about social determinants of health, that is inherently this sort of frame expanding idea. It's frame expanding in the sense of it's expanding the frame from what's conventionally understood as health to something broader that affects health. It's also frame expanding in the sense that it is a matter that develops over time, right? If people don't live in food deserts, they're less likely to develop diabetes and heart disease, which means they're less likely to need the various kinds of interventions that are so expensive. And all of that stuff at every level is something that reflects a health injustice. So that's definitely right. And indeed, some of the interventions I'm talking about, particularly if we're talking about employment protections, overcoming residential and occupational segregation, right? Those are often thought of as being responsive to social determinants of health. But what I want to say is that's an important insight. And, I want to fully embrace that set of insights, but also say there's a broader insight within the current wave of caring a lot about social determinants of health, which is that health and health justice are matters that aren't just determined by the particular healthcare you get in the particular moment. And that insight might apply to lots of things we don't think of as social determinants of health. So pandemic preparedness, for example, not really a social determinant of health. Really much more, at least not without expanding that phrase to mean something that goes beyond where it's been. Stockpiling PPE and ventilators, for example, stockpiling various health-based interventions, making sure we have vaccines available or a vaccine surge capacity available to identify and then manufacture vaccines for the new pathogen, preparing for multiple different kinds of pathogens that we think are likely to result in pandemics at some point. That's just a health determinant of health. That's not really a social determinant of health, but it reflects the same idea that we need to think today about problems that are going to happen later. And the problems that we have today are often baked in by decisions we made before. Okay, so a couple of takeaways about this. Well, what does all this suggest? Well, one thing it suggests is that in addition to addressing the health problems of today, right, we need to be thinking now about what are the interventions we can make to structure a world in which we don't have those problems tomorrow. And that when we do that, justice is an essential part of the decisions we should be making today. I think it also, just to return to Justice Ginsburg and Missouri versus Jenkins, I think it also deepens the argument for responding to problems at what I've called time two. That often when we see a disparity, we end up in this discourse, which is the discourse that has, completely frozen American anti-discrimination law basically since the 1970s, which is if you can't identify a bad actor who's doing something intentionally wrongful today on the basis of a forbidden category, well, that's just the market operating. That's just natural forces operating, right? This is what Justice Ginsburg is responding to in Missouri versus Jenkins. So Missouri versus Jenkins, I could do this in 1,000 different anti-discrimination contexts, but in Missouri versus Jenkins, right, this is a school desegregation case, Kansas City, Missouri, where there was de jure racial segregation. And then there was a period of time when they removed the explicit requirement of segregation, but the state and the locality were kind of encouraging segregative practices. So de jure under the meaning of the case law still. And then eventually there was an effort to desegregate, and lo and behold, at the same time as the effort to desegregate, story can be told all across the North and the border states. At the same time there was an effort to desegregate, the racial composition of the city of Kansas City becomes substantially less white. And the question is, what do we do about it, right? This is the story of Milliken v. Bradley in my neck of the woods, but this is a story that can be told everywhere. The question is, what do we do about it? And the majority says, yeah, White people are going to move out. People get to make their choices. That's just the operation of the market. It's natural forces. And the courts can't step in and try to follow those people when they move. They're just making choices in order to achieve something that looks like integration today. You can't care about what's going on today if there aren't people, there aren't state actors who are making decisions today that themselves reflect intentional discrimination. And the point that Justice Ginsburg makes is that's the wrong way to think about it. All of those individual choices that are being made by people today that can't be attributed to some state actor today telling them to do something are making choices in light of and in a world that is completely structured by a set of state decisions that have been made over many, many years that did reflect and have reflected and haven't overcome intentional state discrimination on the basis of race. And when we think about issues like health justice today, when we think about health inequalities that we see based on race, based on sex, based on social class, what the over time perspective helps us remember is that's not something the justice of which should be assessed purely on the basis of people's motives today. But how was the world structured that got them to the place where we have this set of patterned results? And was that world structured in a way that itself reflected injustice? And very often we're going to find yes. So I think fundamentally what this perspective underscores is the need to take our history and local history, particular history, seriously, to recognize that what looks like a problem today may be more of a problem when we think about the conditions that structure it. And that we need to act today to overcome that as well as whatever is the problem that we're seeing right now, and that we need to be thinking right now about the problems of the future. So thank you very much for having me here. I very much appreciate it. And I have about 20 minutes for questions.
We have a couple of microphones that are available for anyone who has questions here in the courtroom. And also, if anyone is on Zoom and has a question, I encourage you to type it in the Q&A. Anybody in the courtroom?
Thank you for that. That was fabulous. I end up reading a lot of political science, and I think about this a lot. There's folks who argue for incrementalism and those who argue for structural change. And I'm hearing this speech as being firmly planted in sort of systemic change is needed.
I was going to say,
Structural
I'm
change.
firmly planted in both camps. Yeah.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask. I mean, is it, obviously these are large intractable problems that we're talking about. I'm curious of your thoughts about implementation of what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, so that is a great question. I mean, for myself, you know, I am very much a pragmatist in terms of how one should respond. I mean, to any problem of justice, that you sort of are in the place where you are and you try to find the levers that are available to you. You know, and I think that is just reflective of, as Mary said, introducing me, kind of the weird professional trajectory I've followed, where I've spent a lot of time thinking about things academically, but I've at the same time been, you know, really deeply engaged in litigation, organizing, other kinds of efforts, and governmental efforts. And, you know, it's always seemed to me that what's important is to take the opportunities you have. And so that's the incremental, pragmatic, opportunistic piece, Well, not treating those opportunities as the goal in and of themselves. And I think the problem our political system often falls into, and it's just, I live in DC now. One of the reasons I like actually not living in DC most of the time is there is this sort of DC think that reduces the pragmatic to the basic principle. So like, well, there's no reason why we should think about anything broader than drug price negotiation, because that's obviously the only thing that we're going to convince anybody to do. So I guess I think it's important to articulate kind of the pole star. What are the things we're trying to lead toward and why? Well, then looking at the same time for whatever opportunities we have to move toward that.
Hi, thank you so much. Really enjoyed your talk. My question comes from a comment that you made. So you were talking at one point about how the issue of having static injustice versus having justice that focuses on problems over time is a justice problem that sort of reveals that we have a system that doesn't take seriously the needs of the vulnerable. And I do agree with you. And at the same time, I also think about the fact that us not taking seriously the needs of the vulnerable reflects a values problem, right? Like, so for example, our interest in public safety is in tension and in conflict with our interest in economic imperatives, right? Like, so some of the things you mentioned. So is it really, does it begin and end with our inability to value the needs of the vulnerable, or do you think that it more so begins and ends with our values being in tension with one another? And if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I'm not, and I think my answer to that would probably be, you could ask me that question on different days of the week, and I would give you opposite answers. I mean, I do think there are, although I think if we're going to do it every other day, like I would say 4 days of the week, I would say it's not taking the interests of vulnerable communities seriously. And 3 days a week, I'd say it's value tension. So I'd be a little bit skewed in that direction. I mean, of course, like the fundamental problem of, life and politics and policy is even within any individual, we have conflicting values. And certainly when you have different folks within a polity, and all polities are going to be diverse in one way or another, you're going to have conflicting values both within individuals, within groups, and across those groups. And that leads to hard choices, and that leads to, decisions that may look suboptimal from any particular perspective. So I think that's right. And, on that, like, the issue is to kind of argue it out democratically and, deliberatively. Do we take public safety more seriously than we take, something? Okay, that I think that makes sense. But I guess there's a degree to which I think that perspective ultimately lets off the hook our system for, having a set of interests and a set of people whose interests it privileges. And I think, it's important to elevate the sets of course, conflicting, but consistently in some ways different interests of folks who are often left out of the process. So, I think my answer is a kind of both and to you, but I think it's a really interesting question that I have to admit I just struggle with.
This may be a very dumb question. And I say that, and I know the rule, there's no dumb questions, but it is. Because you all may know this and I don't. Can you share an example where what you're talking about has been achieved, where our government, our society has addressed something at its core?
Yeah, I mean, so that, again, like a deep, challenging question, actually. I don't think that's a dumb question. I think it's a deep, challenging question. I think we can find places where we've done that, sort of local places in the sense of particular issue areas or particular problems. and certainly efforts to, I think like the whole move toward social determinants of health is an example of that. I mean, so we have increasingly public policy focused on, how do we make sure that people can get adequate access to good, nutritious food for, the food as medicine idea. Increasingly, there's policy behind that, and that is addressing a problem closer to its core. I think what makes it a deep challenging question is I used to have a boss, one of my favorite bosses, Tom Perez, who was Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration. Before that, he was the head of the Civil Rights Division. And he used to use a lot of like sort of cliched phrases, but he'd get them a little bit wrong, which was really winning, actually. I mean, we all sort of thought he's a very hard charging guy. And so like the fact that he uses all these cliched phrases a little bit wrong was kind of cute. And one of the things he used to say is, we're going to peel the onion to its core. And you think about that for a second. Well, what's the core of an onion, right? And I think that what's really challenging about the question is, well, what's the core, right? Yeah, so like we can get a step deeper, but there's always a step before that. And how deep can we get? And I think that actually raises sort of really challenging questions about like whether this is a useful perspective, how useful a perspective it is, how to implement it, how to kind of take the ideal and the pragmatic and marry them together. So I think there are definitely places where we've taken the idea that we need to look at problems at time one in order to avoid problems at time two, and we've thought about that in terms of justice. Could we do that a lot more? Yeah, I think so.
So much said here. Amazing. I can't touch on all the questions I have for you, but I'll start with this simple question about, this stubborn sort of process that we live in. That it feels a lot like, I've been in the work for many, many years, and it feels a lot like we get to a point where we're about to achieve some of, these amazing goals. And then, there are people within the system who are completely resistant to that change. Case in point being, critical race theory is an idea, a legal theory that's built around fixing some of these historical problems, or at least identifying them so we can start to think about fixing them. And I really appreciate that you're talking about Justice Ginsburg's sort of return to the past to look at the future, right? Looking at the original sins of our jurisprudence to really think about how we can fix things here and now and going forward. From your perspective, I guess, we can't really say that there's anything we as individuals can necessarily do to change many of the minds out there, but what can we build with our legal structures as we connect with the healthcare systems, we connect with, our historians, and try to build these things together to really put up walls against this backslide, this attempt to destroy the things that we have actually successfully built.
Yeah. No, I think, that is sort of for folks, you've actually really described well kind of the way I feel a lot of the time, that it is disheartening, to do work that is justice-focused work in the world we're in. And we've seen these moments, I mean, certainly in my adult life, we've seen these moments where it really looked like, oh, we're very much achieving something. And then we see the backlash, and I think that is with, thinking about history, like every cycle of achievement of justice has a backlash attached to it. And it's tempting to actually, like, I think about people like Derek Bell, who was a professor I learned a lot from. I mean, you're talking about curriculum. Derek Bell is a professor I learned a lot from in law school, and later. And, I think one of the consistent arguments he makes is, don't try to persuade yourself that you've ever really achieved justice, because we live in this world that is just so structured by a long history of injustice. It's going to fight back. And Yeah, I mean, I think all we can do, aside from, trying not to be disheartened, and I guess I have a very personally sort of existentialist view about this of, sort of a Camus kind of view about this, like, well, I don't know what the hell else I'm gonna do, but keep moving forward. Like, I don't know that this actually, I don't know what we can achieve, but I know that like what I'm here for is to try to keep moving this forward. And I think to try not to get disheartened, but also to be unafraid to articulate the history that has structured us. I think there is an effort to get people to be afraid to talk about history, and so that's the thing I keep returning to. And that's, one of the reasons why I do like that opinion of Justice Ginsburg's. I mean, because again, she's just calling our attention to something that the majority wanted us to ignore, that this is not just a, 1990 problem or what 1995 problem when she was writing. I mean, this is a problem that goes way back, and that's the problem of injustice in America. And like, yes, America is great promise, and it's also this history, and we have to understand that history. So to me, that's the number one thing, just to keep making sure that people don't forget that.
So we've gotten some questions in the Q&A, and I want to make sure we get to at least one or two of those. But before I give you the question, I can't let the opportunity pass to remind everyone that Derek Bell, who Sam just mentioned, is one of our most distinguished alums here at Pitt
That's
Law,
right,
member of
that's right.
the class of 1957. But one of our attendees asked, today there are reports that maternal mortality climbed dramatically during the pandemic and women of color died disproportionately. We've talked about this problem for years, but without results, any new legal approaches to attack this problem. And I would just add as my 2 cents, it's even more concern in light of increasing restrictions on women's access to pregnancy and abortion care.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think so, I mean, now you're like hitting on stuff that I work on a lot every day, and that at HHS we're working on a lot right now. I mean, this is, I think it was CDC that in the last week or so issued a new report on precisely this issue. It is shocking the degree to which maternal mortality has increased. And I think there's been, we have undertaken a lot of efforts to try to get state Medicaid programs to expand both prenatal and postnatal care, and a number of the states that are not so keen on Medicaid have interestingly been willing to give the 12 months of postnatal care under Medicaid for groups that they wouldn't otherwise. And, what that's about, I think may in part be some folks saying, honestly grappling with the fact that in a world where the Supreme Court just took away reproductive choices from women in half of the states, or a very large number of the states anyway, and where we have a federal judge who is deciding whether to take away reproductive choices from women in all states right now, that the group of folks who have been supporting those developments need to actually put up or shut up about supporting mothers. I don't think they're a trade-off for each other. I mean, to me, I think we need to do both. We need to protect the rights of people to control their bodies and make decisions about their pregnancies, and we need to make sure that we are providing all of the maternal health protections we can. I think the maternal mortality issue to some extent is really caused by a lot of these same problems that have caused all of the COVID-based inequalities. We're talking again disproportionately about poor women, and I think in addition to the things like occupational segregation, residential segregation, lack of protections that have led to increased vulnerability to COVID, there's also just the way that our health system was overwhelmed, and that's made having sort of normal kinds of health care much harder to access. there's just been the fear of accessing healthcare in a time of a pandemic when there aren't and haven't been very effective countermeasures. So there's that as well. And again, that's a health justice problem, and that's why we have to prepare more for this. But it's real, and I think there's something ineffable, but I'm going to bet that 15 years from now, we're all going to have a whole lot of evidence that the pandemic and the societal effects of the pandemic just caused an enormous amount of stress to all of us in a way that affected health outcomes. And we're going to be able to tie that together because it did. I mean, you can see it in various ways. So yeah, I think that is, one of the major day-to-day kind of health justice issues we're seeing right now.
So you mentioned about, the social determinants of health. We're, here in Pittsburgh where there's a lot of air pollution.
Yeah.
So, and with climate change being a very important thing, I want to know your thoughts on the, what environmental health and health justice and how it correlates to health justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're very closely related, and to some extent, like that's an even closer relationship than a lot of the things we talk about social determinants of health. I mean, environmental health, and we're talking about toxins being introduced into the environment in a way that is, in neighborhoods or in workplaces where you have folks who are already members of disadvantaged communities, getting even further disadvantage heaped upon them. I think that is one of the core aspects of health justice. And this is, I think, one of the things that my boss, Secretary Becerra, has made very clear is he really thinks about environmental justice as essential to health justice. And I think that's right. People often like to talk about environmental issues as being about sort of aesthetics. Certainly when I was growing up, and kind of a young, person interested in activism, one of the reasons why environmental activism never really appealed to me is because the people who were pushing environmental activism were sort of talking about the beauty of the land, which I think I was too young to appreciate. I actually totally appreciate that now and think it's great and love it. But as we've seen environmental activism become much more focused on the effects of either pollution or plant siting decisions or other kinds of environmentally inflected decisions on disadvantaged communities, I mean, you really see the justice aspect of it. I spent 3.5 years of my life representing individuals in Flint who were poisoned by lead pipes and water that leached the lead from their pipes. That was a justice issue, and that was an environmental issue, and that was a health issue. And I think so many of these issues really are all. Thank you. Thank you.